welcome to everybody who's shown up. Just as a note, we're recording tonight. So welcome to Practice Best Practices Writing Placemaking Grants Workshop. I'm Dan Santoro. I'm the project manager for Practice Best Practice, among other things, and I'll be hosting tonight. I'd like to start by thanking our principal co-sponsors, Fall River Arts and Culture Coalition and New Bedford Creative. FRAC is running the Ignition project of artist grants, which tonight is part of, and Ashley Okino, the director of FRAC, will tell you about that in a minute. New Bedford Creative is also running a series of placemaking grants, and Margot Saunier will tell you about those shortly. We also want to thank our generous funders, Rockland Charitable Trust Foundation, and the Carver, Dartmouth, and New Bedford Local Cultural Councils, which are local agencies which are supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency, which is also a funder. We're also supported by generous in-kind support from our partners, National Park Service, New Bedford Art Museum Artworks, New Bedford Co-Creative Center, S&G Project Gallery Art Brokerage. We also want to thank Abby Heavey, Dina Hayden, and Dawn Estabrooks Salerno for taking their time from their busy lives to create the workshop content and take the time to answer your questions tonight. And a few notes before we begin, just ground rules for being in the workshop. If you have questions during the workshop, please type them into the chat. Some of our board members will be monitoring the chat, and when we select your question, we'll ask you to unmute so that you can ask your question out loud. This will also give us the ability to ask follow-up questions if needed. If you prefer us to read your questions rather than go on screen yourself, then please tell us that when you type in your question. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentations. You can unmute when asking questions. We suggest you put your Zoom in speaker mode rather than gallery mode during the presentation. It'll make it easier to see the screen shares. Closed captioning is available. You can turn it on with the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. We will have a short survey online, which you can take right here in the meeting, which we'll put up near the end of the session. Feedback is important to us, so please fill it out. We really use the information we gather from that. You can also add comments about the workshop in the chat as we're wrapping up, or you can email them to contact@practicebestpractice.com. We'll also be putting the recording of this workshop online at practicebestpractice.com within a few days for those who missed it or wish to review. If you're on our email list or social media, you'll see when we put notices up that the workshop is available, and all of our past workshops are available for viewing too. So we hope you'll check those out. We hope you've liked us on Facebook and Instagram and signed up for our email list. And although our workshops are always free, they do cost to produce them. If you would like to make a tax-deductible contribution to Practice Best Practice, you can find a donate button at the top of every page on our website. Now, before we begin the actual workshop, here's Ashley Okino, Director of FRAC, to tell you a little bit about the Ignition project.
Thank you so much, Den, and welcome everyone to Writing Grants. And so the Ignition Fund is a pilot program from FRAC, and this pilot program is an artist recovery program that it brings a multifaceted approach to advancing the creative economy. And so this workshop is just one part of it. The Ignition Fund is also a micro-granting program. Our grant window has closed at this time, but we hope to reopen it again in the future. The Ignition Fund is generously sponsored by Mass Development's TDI Creative Catalyst Grant Program, and so I do want to recognize and thank them for sponsoring FRAC's work. And back to you, Den.
Thank you, Ashley. And next, we're going to have Margot Saunier tell you a little bit about New Bedford Creative and their grants program. Margot?
Thanks, Den. Hi, everyone. It's very exciting to see all of you. So New Bedford Creative has 3 grant programs. We have Wicked Cool Places, which is a placemaking and placekeeping grant program. Art is Everywhere, which takes a current challenge facing residents or businesses in New Bedford and coming up with an arts or culture-based solution for it. And ArtNet, which is brand new this year, and it is an artist training and recovery network, and it provides New Bedford artists with a $4,000 capital working grant and access to trainings just like this one, as well as networking events. So we are about to announce 70 grants with all of those programs. So all of the deadlines have passed, but if you are an individual artist who lives in New Bedford, we are holding a waiting list for our ArtNet grants, and we will be coming out with the next round for 2024 later on this year. So only a few months from now, those grants will be open. So I encourage you to check out our website, which I will put in the chat. And although this is not a grant, I do encourage everyone, and you don't have to be a New Bedford artist to join our creative directory, and that's free to join, and that's how we promote artists in the area. And we know because artists have told us that they've gotten placed and jobs because of that creative directory. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back to Den.
Okay, now without further ado, let me introduce our presenters. Dina Hayden is the director of the Co-Creative Center in New Bedford and so much more. Dawn Estabrooks Salerno is the executive director at the Rotch-Jones-Duff House Museum in New Bedford and has extensive other leadership roles in the region. And Abby Heavey is the manager of grants and development for Coastal Food Shed and the development consultant for Youth Opportunities Unlimited, among other roles. We suggest that you read their full bios on our website for more info on the panel's background. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dina to begin the actual presentations.
Okay, thank you, Den. And thank you everyone for being here and for having me. My background, I'm the director of Co-Creative Center, and I'm on the team of Superflat New Bedford and the co-chair of NB Creative. So I often sit on a lot of the grant committees and see wonderful applications come in, mostly in New Bedford. I've also sat in on mass developments grant committees. So I've had the privilege of reviewing a lot of different grants for placemaking and art space grants. So I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A afterwards. But this portion, I'm going to share my screen, is just to cover placemaking and placekeeping and to discuss just certain projects that I've seen and worked on myself in New Bedford that are examples of what that is. So here. Sorry, I never, here we go. Okay. Okay, so I just kind of went over. So most of the grants are for placemaking and placekeeping in New Bedford. This first, 1 second, let me just move this. This first slide is about placemaking. And sorry, I'm just gonna move some of the, okay, I'm sorry, okay. So placemaking, and this is from NB Creative's website. This is what we base our placemaking off of. And placemaking is, as most of you probably know, I'm sure it's been around for a while, but it's a new term that I feel as though a lot of people don't understand what it is when they're applying for a grant. So I thought that I would show a couple of examples of how different mural projects and other projects in the city have embraced placemaking and gone beyond just creating a mural, which I think we often see a lot of applications that are just for either teaching a class or creating a piece of art or public art that needs to go a little bit further to embrace placemaking. So placemaking is with community-based participation at its center. An effective placemaking process capitalizes on a local community's assets, inspiration, and potential, and it results in the creation of quality public spaces that contribute to people's health, happiness, and well-being. So for example, we created at Superflat, New Bedford, a mural in the in the South End, Create Your Future, and it was created by Vice One Cedric Douglas, and we partnered with NB Housing Authority. And there's a small video here. I'll just leave it and we can share it after the presentation. But what we did was we partnered with NB Housing Authority and also New Bedford Art Museum. And we created a program where we brought Cedric in to work within the New Bedford Housing Authority with the neighborhoods. And so we kind of had certain classes and cookouts and really garnered their feedback on what they wanted to see within their neighborhood. So we selected a site. Oops, sorry, was it? Sorry, I'm not used to here. Yeah. So we selected a site in the Rosewood Gardens on Route 18, and we had these kind of like small papers that we brought around, and Cedric actually walked around the neighborhood to ask what they thought of their place in their neighborhood and what they wanted to see within public art. So it was over about 6 months that we built this relationship within the community before we even got to what the mural would look like. So these are some pictures in the neighborhood. This is the site selected within that neighborhood. And then you can see it's a portrait, and it's actually of one of the children that lived in one of these houses. So this is just an example of how you can integrate public art into the community, which then creates a place beyond just the wall. So this is just some examples here. And a couple of other examples, there's so many of them. I initially had a really long list. New Bedford and Fall River have so many amazing examples of placemaking that happen all over. And it can be really in small increments, but it could have really large projects. Third Eye Open, who I think some of them are on the call right now. And if you've ever been to a Third Eye Open, it's the perfect example of placemaking. It really embraces the local youth and their hip hop culture and how they see art as a vehicle for empowering the youth and creating a future. So Third Eye Open is a youth-oriented and family-friendly annual cultural arts event focusing on the positive energy of hip hop, and Third Eye on the Pride, a monthly performance and mentoring opportunity for emerging young performers. So this Third Eye Open now happens in Wings Court in New Bedford, which is in downtown. It used to be in Buttonwood Park, so it's evolved over, I'm gonna kind of guess, but 20 or so years. So that's a great example of placemaking. And Reggae on West Beach is also another example of placemaking, which if you've been, it's also in the South End. It's right on the water. So it's a free community event that's inclusive, multi-generational, welcoming, and family-friendly for all who attend, celebrating many styles of reggae, world music, modern, and more. It takes place in West Beach in the South End of New Bedford, and there's vendors, food trucks. We've also created a lot of public art and smaller murals there. So again, it is multifaceted and is a celebration of the neighborhood and embraces community as well as art. And they seem pretty simple, but there are some, very often on the review committees, we'll receive proposals for creating a really beautiful public art piece or a performance of music, or which in its own right has all the qualities to receive a grant. But there are some key factors when it comes to placemaking, and there are little tips of like how you can go further with your proposal, embracing the community, involving the neighborhood that you're thinking of working in, or how to bring your music out into the neighborhood. So there just needs to be a little bit more thought around integration and how your work can impact the community you're working in at large. And again, it doesn't have to be anything innovative, or it could be very simple, like involving food and, you know, but multicultural events. So, and I'm just gonna I'm happy again, I'll answer any questions post our presentations. And placekeeping is, for myself, at NB Creative, we added placekeeping on, like technically onto the grant cycles, and I guess in the past year or so, which it's very important, and it got brought up to us that placemaking wasn't really representing placekeeping, because it's more about, placekeeping is more about honoring the history. So the active care and maintenance of a place and its social fabric by the people who live and work there. It is not just preserving buildings, but keeping the cultural memories associated with a locale alive, while supporting the ability of local people to maintain their way of life as they choose. And I selected one of our projects that Kat Knutson, who's also on the call, we worked with alongside Fiber Optic Center. They wanted to create a jazz mural within downtown New Bedford. And they came to us at Superflat and they asked if we would help create this mural honoring all of these jazz musicians who in history had played in New Bedford. And they performed here on this site, and also music still is performed at this site. So it's a great example of how this is placemaking, but also placekeeping, because we're honoring the history of these musicians. And Kat did a phenomenal job creating this mural in partnership with the New Bedford Historical Society. So again, a lot of research went into this project, in meeting with the family members of these past musicians that played here, and, you know, getting photographic material to create the best piece. And I'm sure Kat could explain it a little bit better, but she wanted to create a scene, and I'm not the biggest jazz person, but where she recreated a scene where they were riffing off of music with one another. And so she really created this dynamic scene, which never actually was a moment, but she created it from photographs. So these are just some simple examples of keeping and placemaking. And that's what I have for you guys. And I will stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you, Dina.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Dawn, if I remember correctly. I believe I do. Who will be continuing on.
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm also going to pull up my slides. And hopefully you're looking at my slides. So hi, everyone. Again, I'm Dawn Salerno. You might know me as the director of the RJD. However, I also, for many, many years, have volunteered my time on many grant review committees. So I'm more here in that capacity. This really doesn't have anything to do with my day job, except that I both write grants and I review them. So so I hope I can be of a help to you, with questions and then that kind of thing. So I've reviewed local, state, and federal grants. I think my first position was on the Connecticut Humanities Grants Committee. I also got into designing grant programs with them, and I'm doing a little bit of that with the New Bedford Education Foundation. We're kind of, tweaking the grant program itself, like how it runs, who it goes to. I've also been a reviewer for the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the National Endowment for Humanities, Mass Cultural Council, local New Bedford Local Cultural Council, and I'm also, if you've applied for a Wicked Cool Places grant, I review for them as well, just so you know my background. So my portion today is going to be to really do the basics with you, and I apologize if this is too basic. Don't worry, because I'm going to be only 10 minutes or less, and we're going to go into more specifics after my part of the presentation. So starting with the main components of the grant, of any grant, this is going to apply to most grants you'll look at. You're going to have these four main sections. They might be organized differently. They might be consolidated into two sections, but you'll have your boilerplate and your basics, the stuff that really doesn't change that often, except when you add something to your resume. So you want to keep all this stuff ready to go and update it, your name, your contact info, all your social. If you're an organization, your mission, vision, your past activities, keep track of them, even if you're not writing, getting grants now, keep track of that. It's like your resume, a history of your organization, maybe your experience as an artist. Now, specific to each grant, you might be adding in the location. This is the placemaking workshop. So that's going to be very important, right? And also the grant amount, that's going to change per grant. But these are still the basics of every grant that you're going to write. We'll talk a lot more about the narrative, because that's the stuff between the bread. That's the that's the sandwich there. The narrative is the what and the who for. So we're going to dig deeper into that. Then you'll have a supporting section, kind of the how of what you just said in the narrative. How are you going to do? What are you going to do? And finally, the attachments, which is the part I love, because it means you're almost done with the grant. You get to the attachments and you kind of just click a few things and you're done. So, so this will be what I'm talking about, giving an overview of. And let me know if my slides don't advance. You should be looking now at the narrative. So the narrative is like telling a story. It's narrative, just think of it that way. You're telling a story. And think of your, the people reading your grant, they may not know you, they may have never heard of you or what you're doing. So you want to tell them the story very objectively and specifically. It usually has these components: goals, objectives, activities, tasks, and descriptions. Goals are going to be like your eagle eye view on what you're doing, the big picture, the impact you're making, what change in the world are you achieving. Think of your end result. Whatever your activity is, you're thinking of your end result to articulate a goal. So here's some sample questions getting at goals. In the Mass Cultural Council grant, I don't know, I forget which grant I pulled this from, honestly. How does the proposed project provide public benefit and contribute to the cultural vitality of the community as a whole? That's their question, getting at your goals. That's their goal. An ArtNet question is, if awarded, how will the grant advance your practice? Obviously, that's for an artist, a single artist. From the Ignition Fund, how does your project use placemaking or placekeeping to directly involve or impact residents, visitors, and or businesses in Fall River's neighborhoods? Okay, these are all the questions that are getting at, your goals. Now, with objectives and activities, I mean, I'm not kidding. If you see all three of those words, goals, objectives, activities, task descriptions, then objectives are going to be more specific than goals. And activities, tasks, and descriptions are going to be even more specific than objectives. So here's an example. Now, this may not apply to all of you, obviously, but just an example. Let's say you're an artist and you're proposing an open studios weekend in a local neighborhood. My suggestion is you work backwards from the specifics. because you're going to know exactly what you want to do, right? I want to do open studios this weekend, these days, these hours, going to have these 7 artists involved. So that's the specific. So those are your activities and your tasks and your descriptions. So for example, you write in that section, open studios will run the weekend of June 21, 22, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., right? You get the idea. Now ask why you're doing that. Why are you running open studios? And that's going to get you to your objective. So here's an objective statement for open studios. This is all hypothetical, by the way. The objective of open studios is to provide cultural programming for area residents while also supporting local artists and businesses. Okay. Now ask why you have that objective. And I think this is the best way to get to the goal. Why are you providing cultural programming? Now you've got a goal, possibly a placemaking goal. Open studios will bring attention to the downtown, furthering its image as a safe, fun, and cultural place for families to visit. There you go. So that's my working process for goals, activities, because I think it's really hard to get at what is a goal, what is a true goal, what is impact, that kind of thing. So moving on. Oh, and just a tip. This is another way to think of it. What's the end result of your activity? And make sure you can back it up with, if you're going to claim that your activity is going to achieve this thing, you should have some data to back that up. So are you teaching art? Because there are studies that have proven the positive impacts of art making on critical thinking skills. So, have that data ready if that's where you're going with a goal. Maybe you want to say that where you're supporting student graduation rates or boosting student graduation rates. There's data out there. So if that's your goal, then make sure you provide the data. And you can use the data, right, for to back up your claims that, look, this is the goal. This is how we're going to achieve our goal. Okay, moving on to the audience who serve. This is still within the narrative. This is still within the storytelling part. You want to tell the grant reviewer who's benefiting from your work. Provide as much detail as possible. How many people are coming to the class, the open studios? How many people might walk by the mural? I'll use the mural example. How would you describe them? What are their qualities? Is it a grade level? Is it an age? What demographic is it? Is it Fall River residents? Is it the downtown neighborhood? What's their group identity? Are they single mothers? Is there an affiliation? Are they New Bedford High School art students? So those are the kinds of specifics you want to get into in describing your audience or who's going to benefit, I would recommend. If you have data from your past projects like this, then you can also add that in. You can say, when we did open studios last year, we noticed all these ages attending. So you have proof, you back it up with, this is who we expect because we know they came last year. All right. If you haven't had a program yet, this is when you might want to look up data on the potential audience. So you can find that kind of data if you're serving Fall River residents. Look at the census. Not that that's everything, but there's data there. There's public school data. There's Chamber of Commerce data. There might be, other data on your specific demographic that you're trying to serve, okay? So here's a sample of a question from the Ignition Fund again. Who are the specific participants or intended audiences? How is your project driven by and or for a diverse population, such as youth and or elderly residents, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ+, people with disabilities, immigrants, English as a second language, armed service veterans, etc. So they're like prompting you, right, on what they want you to define for your audience. All right, the need. Hopefully you're meeting a need, right? The grant reviewers want to know why you're doing what you're doing. What's the need for your specific thing that you think is so important that you want $5,000 for it? Why are you the best person to do that thing? Are you duplicating an existing program, or is your resource more scarce? Do you supplement, not supplant a program? Do you provide something that's not otherwise available or possible? That's always going to be a stronger grant. In placemaking, how do you help keep that place's identity and culture alive or grow it? Okay, so I pulled these from one of the placemaking definitions. Bringing attention to an overlooked space, is your program doing that? Drawing out an overlooked quality or aspect of that place? Are you building on the existing cultural identity of the place? Helping create pride of place, active care, and maintenance of a place by the people who live and work there. So these terms have been said. Dina brought out these terms too. So this can factor into your need. Maybe it's an economic need. Maybe it's a social need. Maybe it's a cultural need, or maybe it's an educational need. These are not your personal needs. This is not just like, well, I could really use some funding, you know? You got to articulate it in terms of the audience. Unless some of the artists' support, like COVID relief grants, could be that very thing, because you weren't able to make art and sell art during the pandemic. If it's that kind of thing, then it is that. It's a relief grant. And in every case, it should always match the grant purpose. So we're almost to those attachments, which means we're almost done with the grant. You're going to find supporting information is these kinds of things. How are you going to do those things you just said you're going to do? If I'm the grant reviewer, this is where I learn even more about your program. What day and time is it? What year is it? You know, what, and all of the, not just the program, but the planning, the evaluation, and you want to be specific here. So June 2023 to October 2023 is better than summer. Be specific, all right? If you even know the dates, put them in. Why not? You have the dates, put those in. Include all your activities. That's like planning, recruitment, maybe you need to hire staff, your marketing, your implementation, and especially your evaluation, because most grants ask for an evaluation, which is in my slide right in front of you. So with the credentialing, just look to see what the grant requests, bios, resumes, look at page limits, please. I just read a grant where I got to a completely blank page and it said, this page was removed because the person went over their page limit. And yet they left a blank page in there to let you know. So it's a shame when we can't see your whole grant. All right, be careful of page limits. The itemized project budget, use the templates that people provide you. If the grant does that, it makes it harder or easier, but at least you know what they're asking for. And then it's very clear to the grant reviewer, you know, you're putting in at least what we're asking for. So these would be salaries, stipends, maybe space rental, marketing, promotion, production costs, supplies. If overhead is allowed, I think there's a question we're going to talk about at the end about supporting operating costs. We will address that. And again, specifics. So not just a salary line, but for staff at $25 an hour times 5 hours is much better than $1,000 or whatever the math is, okay? And then finally, evaluation methods. I think a lot of people that haven't done evaluation, this can be really daunting. So just whatever you know how to do, we're looking for data here. Like, how are you going to know that you achieved your goals? If your goal is, if a measure is like, well, we'll know we're successful when we reach 100 people, there you go. Okay, well, we know we're successful when people tell us we are, then you need to do a survey. You know, well, we'll know we're successful when the mural's done. Okay, there's a measure, and then that's very clear. So evaluation, and then again, once you get to the attachments, you are coasting from here. You should have all these things ready and done. Financials, these are all your tax forms. If you're an individual, it's your 1040, I think. Organization, this is other things. Your project budget might be in this section, or you might have an operating budget for your whole organization. Resumes, bios, proof of past work. I recommend keeping all this stuff kind of current because it's a lot easier to just pull it than create it when you have a grant. So I think I'm stopping there.
Okay, great work, Dawn. And we're going to follow on to that with Abby Heavey is going to tell us, cover a whole other segment of the whole placemaking and grant writing.
Hello, everyone. And thanks, Jen, and Ashley and Margot. Oh, I don't know how to work PowerPoint. So I'm going to jump into kind of more of the, like how I go from looking at an announcement that tells me a grant is available to submitting it how many ever, days or weeks later. And I apologize ahead of time if I repeat things that Dawn has said, but that probably means that they're just good points to really take note. So just a little bit on me. I have a master's degree in professional writing. You do not need that to write grants at all. I've been writing and managing grants since about 2010. I'm currently the manager of grants at Coastal Food Shed. If you guys all shop at the farmers markets or the farm stands or our virtual market, to give a little shout out. And I've consulted over the years for a variety of other organizations. Den mentioned I work for YOU, a youth development organization. I do grant writing for Downtown New Bedford, Inc., and just a bunch of different ones. And yes, so I'm going to go through the grant writing and then just a quick piece on grants management. Because the funny thing is the grant writing is actually the easiest part. And then if you get it, you actually have to implement the program and manage it. So people forget about that part. So grant writing, this is literally what I do. And this, hopefully it doesn't sound silly, but this is really over the 10+ years I've been doing this, of kind of getting a process so that I don't end up scrambling at the last minute. And hopefully this is helpful in like staying ahead of the grant deadlines, because one of the biggest keys about grant deadlines is the deadline is the deadline, not, 10 minutes before the deadline. Hey, is it okay if I hand this in a little late? 9 out of 10 funders are going to say, no, this is the deadline. If you don't get it in, we're not going to consider your application. So when I see the announcement, I really try to just go in right away, and just the first thing I note is, okay, when's the deadline? So I know, all right, I have 3 weeks to work on this. I have 2 months to work on this. I have 3 days to work on this. And I note that. And then I look at the submission process. This is, again, it sounds silly, but it's actually an important one. So sometimes you're just emailing something. I don't see this as much anymore. COVID kind of killed this, but there used to be a lot of grants that you would have to mail or hand deliver like 10 copies of. And thankfully, that was actually one of the benefits of COVID, that people are really accepting a lot more on email now. And then if there's a grant portal, which is becoming more and more common, that's another one to just go into the portal, register as soon as you possibly can. Because that's another, I know, again, I've learned this the hard way, that I'll be like, oh, okay, great, I'll do that a couple days before. And then you get into it and it's this like half-hour process to register, or you need to provide them with information that you don't have, etc. So that's just another like kind of best practice in my mind, to go in and do that. And then when you actually want to start working on the grant, the next best thing, I usually create a Google Doc, or a Word doc, I guess, if you wanted to. And I go in and I start pulling out all of the questions and I just put it into a Google Doc. And that's really so that you don't run into any technical issues with like losing the information that you start typing in. Or another one is word limits. And Dawn pointed this out. Word limits are a big one. And somehow I still manage to do this often, where I will miss that there were word limits. And then when I'm going to submit, it's like, and it, makes me cut back on the content, either the characters or the words. So note that. And yeah, and then there's other pieces like the attachments. It's funny that Dawn says the attachments are the easy part. I always get nervous that I'm going to miss an attachment that is not going to be just easy for me to submit. Like letters of support. Sometimes you need letters of permission. And actually, I do believe that the FRAC grant, if you're doing it like somewhere that you have to have permission from a property owner, you have to be able to attach that. So that's nobody likes to be the person that gets this email that's like, hey, can I just have this letter of permission signed in an hour, please? Thanks. And then you're scrambling at the last minute to get that. Resumes, bios, these are things that just sometimes they take more time than we think they're going to take to create these documents. So that's, again, I just always note like, okay, what attachments do I need to make sure that I have ready to go? And then Dawn said the same thing, the templates, if they offer a template, use the template that they're offering. It's just because that's the way that they're thinking about the budget. It's often a budget template. But even if you type up a grant and it's not in a grant portal, follow follow the questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, follow whatever order. Don't get creative. It's not a time to be creative. And then just note any other stipulations. This is a big one. Is it reimbursement-based grant? That's another, like, especially for cultural council grants. I think a lot of them have transitioned to direct grant awards, but some of them still aren't. And so you got to make sure that you can pay for whatever thing you're asking for ahead of time so you can get the funding back afterwards. And that's actually something more at the state level that we've run into, that we haven't been able to do certain grants because we can't front, tens of thousands of dollars to then be able to get them back. Match requirements is another one that you want to pay attention to. And you can get creative with match requirements sometimes, but sometimes they strictly want, cash match, or the in-kind match is a little easier, but again, just paying attention to that. And then timeline requirements, when you would be awarded. This is another one that just logistically, if they are, so like I'll use the Cultural Council as an example. You submit in October, but their actual funding cycle isn't until, January 1st. Hopefully that hasn't changed. Someone let me know if that has. January 1st through December 31st. So you don't want to say, hey, this program is for this November. This is what we're applying for, because they're gonna toss that out. So you want to make sure that your project is within the time, the time that they are funding. And sometimes, and New Bedford Creative is great about this, they'll put out, the awards will be announced, in March. So you want to make sure that your program starts in March or after March. Because, and I put it down there because it is an important one. Normally, you cannot receive funding for costs you've already spent or invested in grants or in the project. I've seen a little bit more that you can do this because of COVID, but traditionally, until you have like a grant agreement in place, unless they say otherwise, you don't want to spend the money and then think you're going to get reimbursed for it if you get the grant. So I actually pulled New Bedford Creative's Wicked Cool Places, just to kind of give an idea. And then when I looked at this, I was like, well, I kind of just look like the person that highlights everything in a book. So I don't know how helpful this is, but this was a portion of the RFP. But again, the pieces to look at, and I'm not going to read it out to you, but the helping, advancing, the placekeeping and placemaking. But I also note those as like, these are the words you want to weave into your proposal to give them the nod that like you get what they're asking for. Use their language back to them. And then projects that advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will be prioritized. That's always an important thing. And again, you don't want to try to make, if your project isn't doing that, you don't necessarily want to try to force that. But if there's a way that you can highlight that your project's doing that, you want to, because again, they're showing that that's a priority. And then grant awards between $5,000 to $25,000. So don't ask for like $50,000, right? Ask for no more than $25,000. And then this grants cash award can be used for, and I can't see it all because I think it's materials, direct project costs, operational expenses, etc. That's another important one. A lot of times they'll say, we aren't going to fund your operational support, or we're not going to fund equipment. We're only going to fund capital, or we're not going to fund outreach, or whatever the things are. But just pay attention to that and make sure that you're following their guidelines and that you're only asking for the things that they said you can ask for. And I know somebody asked prior to the event or to this workshop about operating costs and how that's can be a tough thing to come across. And I agree, that is a tough thing sometimes. A lot of places don't want to fund general operating expenses. It's becoming, in my opinion, it's becoming more important. Like I'm seeing it more and more because I think a lot of funders are catching on that like it's not 1955 and that a lot of nonprofits aren't just run by like volunteer women who don't have like that don't need to get paid to work. So they are paying for people to actually work more and more. But if it is a funder that's not going to pay for programming, I mean, I guess it's kind of just, or I mean, that's not going to pay for operational expenses and only wants to fund program costs. I mean, sometimes you just kind of have to go with that and find your operating costs in other ways, either, you know, via fundraising or if you're allowed to, or if you can, you know, charging a revenue, like a fee for service or whatever, which I know a lot of people don't like to do, but that is another way to bring in operating funds. And then just to keep running through this real quick. So in order to be eligible, again, make sure that you're following all the eligibility guidelines based within New Bedford, that it is a placekeeping or placemaking grant, and that it's reasonably designed to benefit New Bedford tourism, etc. And people probably are thinking like, this is very easy. Why are you going through this? And the only reason I do is because I've consulted with a lot of people that are like, oh, I understand that we don't fall in the eligibility, but they'll love our projects. So we just need to send them the grant because then they will love it. And I'm like, you can, if you want to spend the time on that, but most of the time they're very clear on what they want to see and what they don't want to see. So, and then again, this just shows, okay, submittable is the online portal that we need to figure out before we submit. And then there's line. So again, trying to pull all these things. And this is just a sample. This was Coastal Food Shed. We actually applied to this. And just to give you a quick, this is like a piece of our application, but that number 3, this is the example I was talking about. Does this location require permission of a property owner? And in our case, we do. We have the Parks Department has to give us a permit to use the park. And then if yes, upload a letter of approval from owner. So again, that's something that I note early on so that I'm like, okay, I've got to send a letter over and explain this to the Parks Department and whatever and get the letter back. And then just in 7, I kind of just highlighted kind of how we talk about our placemaking. And, you know, for placemaking for it's funny because we're a local food organization, but we really work to turn our farmers markets and our mobile farm stands into placemaking opportunities where people can come to build community and celebrate the different diverse communities and cultures in the community or in New Bedford. And then we love to hire local musicians because we're all about the local economy, local food economy, and same thing with local musicians and local creatives and artists. So that is kind of that example. And then again, some of this is going to be repetitive of Dawn, but this is really where I try to kind of back up from all my applications and just make sure like, okay, have I demonstrated a clear need? Like what's the gap in services? What's the community need that we're filling? And then backing up with any relevant data and statistics whenever possible. And I added this little thing. It's a great one if you guys want to steal it, but I just love this, like, as reported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, research suggests that individuals who feel a sense of, I can't see the whole thing, and belonging, trust in their community have better health. So it's just a great little quote to throw in there and kind of back up what you're trying to say. And I try to use data whenever possible. And or even, again, not even necessarily data, but just pulling, you know, someone from somewhere that has some kind of reputation, backing up what you're saying. And then your clear scope. What are you going to do? And then defining the impact of the project you'll have. Again, Dawn touched on all of this. Using your own organization statistics and data. I know people kind of cringe at the idea of data, but you really can't have like too much of it. You know, who are the people you serve? How many people do you serve? What ages are they? What demographics are they? The data can kind of, you can go down like a data rabbit hole, but it's always good to just show that you are like, you're serious about implementing your project, and making sure that you have an impact. And then again, your credentials, and ability to meet it. So just showing that you've done this before. This is, and if it's your first time, you can point to that and say, we're starting out slow because it's our first time that we're doing this. A great word to use when you are starting out is pilot. We are piloting this program, or we're piloting this activity. And then presenting a clear and realistic and detailed. Again, the more numbers, like Dawn said, instead of just saying, yeah, give us like $10,000, that should do it. It's like, okay, we've thought this through. Because the other thing you don't want to do is not think it through and then not have enough money to be able to put your program on. So thinking it through a little bit, like, what is this really going to cost us? And the same thing with presenting a clear and realistic timeline. Again, realistic is the key word. You don't want to, you're gonna do a festival and you're gonna do it next month. Like, that's probably not attainable, and they will probably say that's not attainable. So really thinking through these pieces is important. And then, is it sustainable and or scalable? Grants love to ask if you're going to sustain the program. And that's where you could get a great opportunity to say something like, well, of course we are, and we're doing fundraising, and we're charging these fees, a minor fee to community members when possible. And we always are looking for funders who will support our general operations because they are so important and critical to us being able to do the work we do, right? You kind of throw in a little like nudge on that. And then this last piece, the who, what, when, where, how, I kind of just use that. Again, it sounds silly, but the number of times when I finish drafting, I go back and I literally say to myself, okay, have I said who we are? And have I said what we're going to do? And often I'll be like, oh God, I didn't even say when we're going to do this or where we're going to do it. So it's a simple little kind of checklist to go through to make sure you're covering all the bases so that the review committee isn't left with these questions. And again, I won't go through this in detail, but just some more tips. Again, follow the application as presented. Sometimes they want a certain font, they want a certain size. Again, page limits, character limits. Knowing your audience, like Dawn pointed out, don't throw in a whole bunch of acronyms that people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. Make sure you are talking to them like they wouldn't know what you were talking about if you were trying to explain it to them. And the same thing with simple language. You don't have to use big fancy language. I write grants like I would be talking to somebody and explaining it to them like at a party. Brevity is key. You don't need to ramble on and on and on. I feel like this is like everything this is the unlearning of high school English, or if you took any English classes in college, and then weave their language into the proposal, use bulleted lists whenever possible. And this kind of the same thing with write short paragraphs in white space. We all know what it's like when you get an email or some kind of like correspondence that's just a giant block of text. You immediately, like, your brain just kind of shuts off to it and you don't want to read it. So white space is a really important way to hold someone's attention and break up what you're writing. I mean, again, you have to watch out for page limits, and sometimes you end up just putting in blocks of text, but as much as you can, white space is a great friend to the reviewer. This is just a nod to drafting letters of support for partners. Again, it's always nice to kind of draft something up for them. And letters of support can be 2 or 3 paragraphs. They do not have to be these super intense letters, but it's just a nice gesture for the person. Again, instead of asking them to just create something out of thin air when then they don't really know what you're trying to do or what the project is. Any opportunities to collaborate, I think funders like to see that. And again, being aware of other projects in the city or in your area and not duplicating the same thing. And then I also like the last bullet, just think about if you were being asked to donate to your project, or just how you think about donating to somebody else's organization or project, what are the things that kind of either like are like, oh, I want to donate to them because they're doing A, B, and C, or like, oh, I don't want to donate to them because they kind of look like they don't really use the money well. Or I mean, but it's a good mindset to shift into, to think about how you put together your proposal. And then just last, I just put together a slide on grants management, because again, the writing of the grant is great, but yay, you get the money. Now you have to actually implement the project. So just a best practice, send a thank you letter. And then again, write down all reporting deadlines and requirements, and any other requirements that they have, and then meet those requirements. Keep in contact with the funder. Feel free to reach out to people and just ask them for clarification on anything that you're confused with. If you're finding that like, oh God, our outreach isn't working, or this part isn't working, it's always good to just keep talking to the funder to let them know, here's the things we're trying to do. Because the last thing you want is to get to the end and then write a report that says something like, well, we put the program on and nobody came to it, so there we go. But you don't want to submit a report like that. And then again, create a data tracking system if not already in place. And that sounds really intense, but it could be like simply a Word document that just is like, okay, 10 people came on this date, and then 20 people came on this date. Again, don't spend any money until you have a signed contract or the approval, or they've said that you can spend the money. Provide publicity where appropriate. And then, it's like, thank the funders online, through your social media or other publicity if you want to do. And then again, just make sure you follow the guidelines of the funder on their publicity. And that's like the local cultural councils, they have specific guidelines that they want you to follow. And then follow up and build a relationship with the funder. Again, you get funded in the future. And then I just put it, if you don't get the money, it's always good. And I do this when we don't get grants, follow up with the funder and ask for any feedback on your proposal. Ask if you can have a debrief with them. A lot of places are very happy to do that with you. Rarely do I get like a complete, like, no, we will not give you feedback on your proposal. And then of course, just try again. So hopefully that was helpful. That's it.
Okay, great, Abby. That was wonderful. Some great presentations, and we've got some stuff going on in the chat, which we're going to actually get on screen. Start off, Jacqueline asked the first question, and she asked it quite a ways back, Jacqueline Williams. But Jacqueline, would you unmute yourself and ask it out loud so we can have that conversation on the recording? Is Jacqueline still there? Trying to find Jacqueline on the list. Hopefully she has not left. It does look like she has left. Well, that's too bad. Okay, well, let's get the question out there anyway. So Jacqueline asked, will the whole grant writing process be an online process? And we had some good responses. So those of you who responded in the chat, let's have that conversation.
I'm wondering if Ashley could answer that, because this is for about the Ignition Fund.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Jacqueline's specifically asking about the Ignition Fund. So in terms of the Ignition Fund program, yes, it is completely digital. So we've offered one workshop with Practice Best Practice last January. That was virtual, just like this virtual offering. We'll have another workshop coming up in May that will be virtual as well. And then in September, also virtual. The Ignition Fund grant itself was also all through online. The eligibility form was presented as a Google form, and same thing with the actual application. That's also been presented to folks as a Google form. I will say that not everyone has Google, and I recognize that. So we actually have two variations of the Google form, one that allows for uploads and one that allows people to submit attachments in a different way. Because at least for FRAC at this point in our existence, we're not ready for something like Submittable, which is a larger platform. So we're utilizing something like Google.
And I'll add a tip. Always keep your document outside of that online submission form. Some of them
Yes.
don't save as you go. Some of them have timeouts. So you're typing and you're inactive for 10 minutes and oh, it just timed out and it didn't save your text. So in preparation, if you know it's only online, I think no matter what, always keep a Word doc with all of your answers. I even cut and paste the questions and the word limits into my Word doc so I know exactly for next year, and I can prepare everything that way.
That's a good point. I'm glad you said that. Yes, always put it in a different document. I think we've all said that at this point during tonight's session. But what I will also stress is that it's great if funders can give you the questions outside of the application. And you may want to go as far as to take the step to ask them to provide the questions for you outside of the application. The Ignition Fund, we do have all of the questions available on our website, so you can see everything ahead of time. And as Don suggested, you can get the Word doc up and going. And I believe NB Creative has done the same thing with their programs. Yes, where all of the questions are available online. Like, we want you to prepare and know what's going to be asked of you before you begin the application, because as it's been pointed out, it may take longer for certain components.
And more organizations are actually putting stuff online, and usually when they put stuff online, they get asked for availability of that information. So it's starting to become fairly standard that you can see that stuff easily ahead of time. But I totally agree. Keep that in a separate document. Learn how to use your word processor's character count and word count features. So you can do your edits before you're in a hurry. That makes a huge difference.
I'd also just add to that, it's great to save your own copy, because the number of times I copy and paste into another application is frequent. So sometimes you lose this information, right? Or you're trying to figure out if you can get back what you wrote into a portal. So it is great to have your own record of what you actually wrote.
Yes, and most of the portals let you paste into them. So if you write it somewhere else and then have to do a copy and paste into the portal, it's a whole lot easier. Also, you will find that some of the portals count spaces as characters and others don't. So that can make a difference. We also had some resources that are in the chat that you might want to check out for demographics that Margot posted, I believe. Margot, you want to say a little bit about that information?
Well, I learned this from Abby a few years ago. So thank you, Abby. When you are trying to determine the demographics of a specific geographic area, to use the HUD's website, which then we can provide that to the members here. And that can break down by census tracts. You really can get granular if you want to into the income, the race, the education level, the ages. It really breaks down it at least gets you closer to being very specific. As Don and Abby said, you want to be as specific as possible. What we're talking about today are project-based grants. And so who are these projects for? Who's going to benefit from them? And most funders, the more specific you can be, the higher a score you'll receive on your grant. And then Ashley, you had another data statistics resource too.
I did. And so mine is, it's a lot of the same sort of information where it's all pulled from census. It's just displayed a little bit differently. But a lot of it, because it's public information, there's only so many things that are public at the same time. So you might kind of need to think outside the box. So like, for example, one of the things that I've done in Fall River is pull up the police department's annual report. That is another great source where, depending on, maybe you're doing a placemaking project. For me, we were looking at safety. So there are other reports that might exist within your municipality that are just sitting on your city's website, waiting for you to dig them out of like the cobwebs and use them. But yeah, census information as Margot mentioned, whether it's HUD based or just general demographics about your city. There's a lot of it out there.
Great. I'm going to add a few comments here, and then we have a question from Kat that I'll throw out there. I'm going to launch the poll. You can take the poll right here online, and we really appreciate all of the information in the poll. That is part of our ability to write good grants because we know who our audience is. So I really appreciate it if you will take the time to fill that out. It's easy and it's right there online. We are also going to be putting this information up along with the slide decks from the three presenters earlier that will be up in PDF format on our website in the resources section. And I'm going to put a little information about the resources section in because there's another thing I'm going to talk about a little later. All right, so the poll is launched. Feel free to fill that out. If you have more questions, feel free to type them in or raise your hand, get our attention. And Kat, you had a question that I would like you to bring up on screen if you don't mind.
Thank you so much, Jen. This has been a really helpful workshop. I really appreciate listening to all the speakers. My question was if there could be a little bit more detail going into the difference between the operation cost versus the program cost. The reason I'm asking is because I think I work with mural design, animation, illustration, and I teach workshops. And sometimes I feel like there might be a bit of overlap between those two. So I would just love some clarity if that could be provided.
Ooh, me. I know Abby's going to talk on this too. Well, I think we should find out more about what you're trying, what you think are program versus operational, to answer specifically what you might be able to fold into. But I think in reading grant applications, even if they say this won't support salaries or this won't support overhead, I think in many cases you can still justify expenses if you say, like, this is a direct cost for doing this program. Like, even if it's Dawn's 10% of Dawn's annual salary, because I'm spending 10% of my time implementing this program, which is what the grant is paying for. That's one way to get kind of overhead costs into your budget. I think not every grant will let you do that, but some do. Local cultural council grants do, even though they don't like to pay operational costs. If you say, like, this has to be, this person delivers the program, this is the teacher, even though they get a salary, just make sure you're not putting in your whole salary, because obviously you're only using part of your time for this project. And I think in some cases you can do that, like, maybe a portion of your software could be written off. It gets tricky when people, and I've seen it, people want to buy a new computer because they're delivering this program where kids are going to do animation on a computer. So they buy all new computers. There may not be a rule about that, but it can be hard to get that into a grant. So I don't know if you want to give more specifics on what you're trying to count as program versus operation.
Absolutely. So I run a few projects. One of them that's running recently is figure drawing at Co-Creative. So I have to pay a subcontractor to model for those sessions. And so that's directly paying for someone's salary, but they're a figure model, which makes the event possible. I also had to pay a subcontractor to build the model stand. And so the model stand wouldn't be built without paying for that labor. So the event, so that's one example. Another example is I put in a proposal recently. I don't know if it's going to go through or not, but it's for an art publication that's online. A part of that overhead would include paying photographers to be able to use their photography for capturing footage from events that are going on, or to pay, let's say, Illustrator. If one of the projects I wanted to do with that within the publication was to hire an illustrator to create comics. So I'd want to pay them. That would be a subcontractor, but that, I don't know if that qualifies as overhead. And so a lot of times the projects that I run have people's time and labor directly involved. So it's always a big gray area, like figuring out if it qualifies or not, but those are just two projects. that I feel like would be really helpful for me to figure out how to describe them in proposals.
So I would say those are not overhead costs. Those are direct program costs. I don't know what Abby thinks, because like think of overhead as like what's over your head, you know, the lights. It literally is like keeping the lights on, paying your electric bills, paying for your time. But those are all direct deliver. Those are like direct delivery of the program costs. What do you think, Abby?
Yeah, no, I do think that, like, and I probably was too, when I think of general operating, I think of like it's the insurance we pay for everything, which you usually have like a 10% administrative line. So yeah, if they say like we only pay for programming costs, yeah, I would put that in as a direct programming cost, because yeah, if you can't run the program without that specific thing, which again, that could become like a bigger thing, but that staff, and how Dawn said, that's how I would set it up. It's like, we estimate this person is going to spend 5 hours of their time on this project, you know, per week for a few weeks, times their salary, and just show that broken out. And depending on the budget template you use, you could almost show it as like, we pay them $50,000 a year, but this project is only going to cost, you know, $8,000 of their time. And it shows the funder that you're not asking for this full thing. It's just when you see an application like, we will not fund staff time, you know, like those are the ones that it's like, okay. But even then, I have to say, Dawn and Margaret, like, if you're talking about a subcontractor, that's not a staff time, right? Like that's a subcontractor. And the only other thing I would say is, that's probably the biggest thing that comes back. We'll still get funded, but they'll say, we're not funding these line items. We'll fund these ones, but we're not funding these ones. And that happens often. So usually, and again, I'm not saying this like throw everything into your grant budget possible, but if you put together a great project and all the pieces are there and you put in a realistic budget, they often will fund you, and they might just say, we're just not going to pay for Kat's time, but we're going to pay for all these other things. Is that fair, Dawn and Margot? I feel like I see that a lot. And it's not necessarily just that. Sometimes they'll say, we're not paying for this capital expense that you stuck in here. But I don't usually see things get thrown out. I really, Dawn and Margot, I'd like your feedback on that, because as grant reviewers, I used to be on the cultural council, and we would, when I reviewed similar thing, it would be like, well, we'll pay for this portion, but we're not going to, like, we can't pay for this. Like food is a common one that they won't pay for, and people will just kind of act, they won't realize it, and they'll put it in. So then we'll just say, listen, we'll pay for your program, but we can't pay for the food.
Yeah, that happens. That still happens.
Yeah.
And hopefully, you know, hopefully that happens, because then they still give you money rather than throwing out your whole application.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that on a lot of the local cultural council applications, you cannot have food, or there's certain line items. So just be aware of, if that is part of your program, not to add that into the budget, because you never know. It hopefully won't, but it could throw your application out the window.
There are also some things that you have to pay attention to. For example, some grant writing, some of the grants will let you put in certain operational costs, like they will let you put in accounting time to manage the grant, because you're going to have to write checks. You know, so you're going to have to keep track of that money and what it was spent on. Sometimes you do that as a percentage. Sometimes you do that as a specific, you know, item with amount of time and what you pay your bookkeeper or whatever, or if you're the bookkeeper, what it costs for you to do it. But so there are ways to look at some of those costs as, you know, as we were talking about it as part of the actual budget, because they are very much program related, and other things that you might think of as operating costs, not program costs, but they really have to be program costs, because you can't take a grant in and not manage it. They won't let you.
And I would add just one more thing. feel free to reach out to the funder and ask them the question directly beforehand and have that discussion with them. Most funders, Margot knows, I pester her often with questions on the grants, but feel free to ask them. And sometimes it's fun. Sometimes they'll say like, oh, we can't answer that. But most of them, they will say like, yes, that would be eligible. Put it in this way. So I think open communication, and another perk of that is then you can spend a few minutes letting them know what your project is, and then they get to know you. And then when they see your application come across their desk, they're like, oh, I remember talking to Kat. Okay, let's see where her application is. So don't be shy, call them. And that's not even just budget. Anything that you're like, what are they talking about? What are they looking for? I suggest calling or emailing and getting that clarification from them. It doesn't hurt at all.
Yeah, I will reiterate that because Ashley is here. If you're applying to that grant, or if you apply, like, you develop a relationship with her, same with me. I mean, I know many of you who are on this. Wicked Cool Places is one of the most competitive grant programs we have. We received 45 applications. We had funding for 13. So a lot of people got rejections. We're about to send out notices for the Art is Everywhere grants. We were able to fund 17 of those, a little bit more, but there will still be some people, significant people, getting rejection letters. I know, because I'm on both sides. I had to write a grant in order to get the funding to do Wicked Cool Places, Art is Everywhere, and ArtNet. So it is devastating when you receive a rejection letter. But what Abby said is use that to continue building the relationship with the funder. So we have met with many people who did not get a grant, and they've sat with me or Marianella, who's the New Bedford Creative Senior ARPA Fellow, and taken the advice on how they can improve their grant application the next time. And then some of them have success. Some of them are receiving acceptance letters right now. So it's building that relationship. Try to not take it personally. And if you do need help, reach out. The goal, at least I'm speaking for myself, like, we want to build all of your capacity to apply for grants so that you are receiving funding to do these important projects that's going to impact all of our communities. So it's important for us that you are continually learning and building that skill set, because these are local funding, right? We're being funded by the City of New Bedford's ARPA funding right now. There's Mass Cultural Council. They have more grants than the local cultural councils. They have they have festivals grants. They have a lot of other grant programs. And then there's a lot of grant programs for artists. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. Start small, build the relationship, continue to build that skill set, and success will come.
Also, even if you're not in a position where feedback would make some sense, for example, you're in a position where it's just a generic kind of grant and you submit the information, and how you write it is not important. The fact that you qualify and then maybe get selected, maybe don't. No matter what, send them a thank you, even if they reject you. Say, thanks for considering my grant. Thank you for reading it and reviewing it. I understand there are always more requests than you can possibly fund. I hope that we'll, talk again in the future, and we can learn from this and maybe do better next time. Funders love that. We have a question from Ron that he sent directly to me, but I'm gonna read it out loud. He says, are the presenters' PowerPoint files available? They will be. They'll be on the website under the workshop in the resources section. All of our workshops have a resources section if there are resources available. He also wants to know how you can save the chat. If you look at the bottom of the chat, there's 3 little dots. And if you click on the 3 little dots, one of the options is save chat. So feel free to save chat. That'll save all of those links that are in the chat and all the other conversation that's in the chat for you as well. It's a good thing to know about Zoom anyway. Another thing, and I'm going to put a note, a link in the chat right now, is that for those of you who may have already gotten grants or are trying to get grants, especially if you're trying to get individual grants, Practice Best Practice put together a tax advisory for individuals who are getting grants, because it's income. You need to know how to account for it. You need to know how to keep track of things so that you don't have a tax surprise at the end of the year. You want to make sure all this money goes into your art or your project. So I'm putting in a link, and if you go, that's the resources page. Now, resources are often broken out by workshop on our website, but some of them are just general resources, and they're in a long list. Very near the bottom of the current list is the tax advisory, and it's geared towards people who are sole proprietors and who are getting grants, particularly first-time grant recipients, and that you should check it out and read up on it to learn what you should be keeping track of and how to be keeping track of it. We had this vetted by Boston Legal Services Tax Department and by one of the accountants that we've worked with for workshops before. So the information is accurate. It is not tax advice. It's simply an advisory for you so you can learn some stuff about how you should also talk to your own tax accountant, or you should go through your tax forms, your tax software to know more. Other questions?
Did you see Crystal's question? I can address it.
Yeah, go ahead. Where is the question?
Crystal, oh, now I lost it. Oh,
I
grant
had, is it the
report.
grant report?
Yep. Grant report versus business career
Versus
plan
business
for
career
ArtNet. So all of the artists who are part of our ArtNet program at the end of the year are required to submit a business/career plan. And I think we have language in the contract called an impact report or something like this. So this goes to what Abby was talking about earlier. Yay, you've received a grant. Now you need to do the project or do the things and then report on them. So we will have, there's several of you on here who have received this grant. We will have a template for all of the artists. We'll be working on it in the next few months so that you're not going to have to do this all on your own. Like, we are going to provide you with the template for submitting your final report, but you do want to be keeping track of what you are using the funding for, and the trainings that you're doing, and thinking about your artistic practice and the future of your artistic or cultural practice, and what are your goals with that. So I hope that, Crystal, if that doesn't answer your question, please reach out directly to me, okay?
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. I was going to say you sort of already answered it when you said reach out to me directly already. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Also, get in the habit of tracking all time and funds spent, on anything that you do that's even remotely grant related. If you do it while it's happening, it's easy. If you try and recreate it afterwards, even a week later, you're going to have a really hard time. So keep track as it's going on. Taylor Hickey has a question too. Taylor, you want to ask it on screen?
Sure, you're done. Thank you. I was just curious if anyone with more experience knows, are promo materials something that funders are typically willing to cover with these kinds of grants?
I'll answer that one. Yes. A lot of times funders will be willing to cover promotional materials. And so you even mentioned like social media posts. Yes. A lot of us, that's how we communicate, is through social media, especially boosting and sponsored posts. So do feel free to put that into your application when you're doing it. Margot, you wanted to add more?
I was gonna say the same thing. Definitely include that budget line item. It might not be funded, like, you know, the reviewers may say, okay, we're gonna pay all of the artist fees, this, and this, but we're not going to fund marketing and promotion. So be prepared for that, but certainly, definitely, at least for my program and for Ashley's program, include that in your budget.
And the other thing is
Cool,
there
thank
are
you very much.
funders. Oh, and Taylor, I wanted to add too to that. There are funders out there that actually pay for promotion. So for example, I think it's also depending on like the scale of what you're doing, but there is the Southeastern Mass Visitors Bureau. That entity does exist. They do have funds available for marketing. There's also the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism, known as MOT. They also have funds available for marketing. Both of those are really looking for tourism focused work, but perhaps what you're doing would fit the tourism definition, which means that people are traveling, what is it, 40, how far? There's a certain amount of time travel.
50 miles.
50 miles, thank
If
you.
they're traveling 50 or more miles away, that's I don't know if that's Mass Office of Travel and Tourism's definition, but that's the definition that they use. And so it depends, like Ashley said, if it's something, Taylor, that the art museum is doing, I could see that as attracting tourists. Some programs more so than others, but yeah, definitely check that out because it's specifically for marketing and promotion.
Awesome, thank you. And that's the one that you just sent the link for.
Ron, you had some to add there, see.
Thank you.
Just that I know local cultural council grants also pay for marketing. They call it marketing though. So this can be something that is you might think is overhead, but if it's like, well, it's 4 hours of so-and-so's time to put out all that social media each week, then there's your budget. If they don't pay for it, it's a little more complicated to understand in-kind services in a budget and build that in. But some grants will have an in-kind column. So if they don't pay for it, but you're spending the money, make sure that goes into your in-kind column, because then it looks like a match. And if you've ever heard of like matching grants or something, matches are always look good. Even if they don't ask for it, I can tell you it looks good to the grant reviewer to see that, well, they're sinking other money into this. So it's not just our grant, it's other money, which is a whole separate topic. It goes into that sustainability thing that Abby also mentioned, that like the question of like, how are you going to do this after this grant is over? At least they can see that you're already investing your own money in the project.
We
Also,
could probably, I was just gonna say, we could probably do a whole session on budgeting and budgets.
Yeah.
I hope we plan to do that in the not too distant future. Some of that will also be part of the taxes for creatives for Schedule Cs that we're doing later on in the season, that FRAC is funding. One of the things that you can also do when you're trying to do promotion, if your grant doesn't fund promotion, is find sponsors. You can find organizations that have a relationship to what it is you're doing, that it would make sense for them to have their name all over it. And you can ask them to put up the money to fund the promotion. Dina, you had something in there too. I scrolled past before I got to read it.
Oh, it was just it came to mind. I know that like once you receive the grant funding, sometimes you want to get off the ground if you're a small organization or individual and start paying people, and then but always rule of thumb, I try to get it's pretty obvious, but a W-9 and an invoice from every contractor or artist that I'm working with before I cut any checks. That was just pretty simple, but at the end of the year, you'll be thanking yourself because you won't be trying to find everyone's W-9 when you're doing your 1099s.
Other questions out there? It's like we're thinning down then.
I had one question. Dawn was mentioning something about the in-kind column, and that really perked my interest. And so it'd be amazing to learn what you can include, because if you're doing a ton of time, like volunteer time, on the email, on the marketing, on the organizing, on the like a lot of things, like it would be neat to just look at a website or a link that provides more information on what that means in kind, like what is it that qualifies as in kind, how do you report in kind? Because if you're a fairly new organization and you're doing a lot of the work in kind to show that there's a lot of resources going into your projects, and you don't have as much of a record of like grants, it seems like it would be really awesome to list the bukus of like in-kind activity, energy, and resources that are going to something, and learn how to archive that and show that very clearly.
Dan, you can sign me up for the budget session workshop.
Yeah.
I love doing a budget. I don't know if I could, do you want, I mean, it's a whole new way of thinking in kind, and different grantors won't even care. They won't have it in their budget template, but many do, and some don't define it, but if you put it in, it'll still look good. Like I think, the Wicked Cool Places and Local Cultural Council, if you show that it's a match. But in kind can be anything that the grant's not paying for, but that has a cost. So it could be definitely a lot of salary time. It could be your overhead could go in as a match in some cases. That's all kind of in kind, meaning it's donated services, donated costs.
I wonder, has there been a party that's dedicated themselves to illustrating data that is solely about in kind, just to highlight more of what's usually expected to be in kind services, or what's very often expected to be, I guess, more of an in kind contribution? Reason I'm asking is because one of the side projects I'm working on is a project that's around the hashtag true cost. Like whenever you, as an artist, individual, small business, sole proprietor, want to get something done, there's resources available, and then there's the overhead or whatever true cost it's going to take to execute the project. And it's just trying to lay out clear examples of like, if a project is going to come into life, what are the true cost of things that actually have to happen, whether they get funded or not, just to like create more like maybe illustrated indexes of like, and that's the teacher in me coming out. So I teach at Bristol Community College, design, visual art courses, digital media, and we have a lot of these conversations sometimes about if the students are going to become independent contractors, if they're going to work for another company, but to be mindful of developing their professional habits and looking at what things are going to cost. So I know I went on a bit of a tangent there, I'm sorry, but I'm still new to the finance side of things. So learning about stuff like in kind, it's like, oh, there's already a term to talk about these things. It'd be neat to learn more about how others have like, talked about, described, given information about that. So.
Also, if you have things like people volunteering their time, that's in kind as well. Keep track of the time and treat it as professional services. Treat it as the value of what those services would be. It's not minimum wage. So think about what it would cost you to pay somebody to do something that somebody is volunteering to do, and then track the time and put it in your budget as in kind at that rate.
Thank you, Dan.
I don't know if we have time for this. I can share a quick, I pulled up one of a budget that we put together. And my disclosure, like I would go to the budget workshop. Budgets are, I've been doing this for 10 plus years. They just run the gamut of like, just say how much you want. Great. This is how much we want. We're at $50,000. And that's like all you have to do. They ask you for these like insanely detailed spreadsheets that luckily I work with a lot of staff that usually they take care of that side of it. But in kind too, if people, I don't know if they don't ask for in kind, I do not include in kind. If they ask for in kind, then I'm like, okay, great, we'll figure out like, and it's anything. And again, you're not making up numbers, but it's any time, any overhead, how much you pay for rent, how much, like, in kind can be like, these are the office supplies we're going to use to, I mean, you could go, if you were a CPA, a CPA would probably have like a field day with an in kind. I keep it more simple. I try to always stick with just, let's do like a simple budget. But it does show it. I do like the ones that show, listen, it costs us $50,000 to put on this project, and we're only asking you for $10,000. Because it shows funders how much this stuff, to your point, like it really costs this much money to do. And a lot of funders, I think, are catching on to that more and more, and are aware of that. But it doesn't hurt to show it on paper. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful at all. I just, in kind can be like
Do you have a quick budget you can share?
I do
Ed?
have one. I have one. Well, hopefully Bernadette doesn't get mad at me. I don't know. It's from YOU. I can show, it shows a little bit of in kind, but it shows like, this is actually for the City of New Bedford's Investing Kids program. So you see the first, like, and this is just for this program. So this isn't like this is not an organization-wide budget. This is just, I think it was like 2 days a week or something that we applied for like 4 or 5 hours to staff, something along those lines. But you can see in the first column, we've got the amount requested, and then our cash match, which is, again, it's the total is that 5,776. And that's the salary and wages. That's not even including the fringe, which you can see on the next line. So it shows that breakdown. And again, this is working with somebody who knows, like, this is the, the bookkeeper who knows, like, this is how much we pay these people per hour. And we broke out the hours and all of that. Oh shoot, I can't. Oh, there we go. And then the in kind is that third column. You see down there, we've got office supplies. And that was literally probably budgeted towards the program. And then the program space rental, that's an in kind. And that's a truly like an in kind donation. And that was all we really put for in kind. Again, these things I try to keep, because the other side of it is, I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay. I don't know how to say this nicely. If they ask you to show proof of this in the end, you want to be able to show proof of this in the end. So you want to be very careful that you don't just start throwing tons of stuff into your budget that, like, oh, this will make us look good if we, oh yeah, it's like $10,000. And then they say, okay, show us your invoices that show that you spent $10,000 on this. And then you're like, oh God, you add up your invoices, you're like, I spent $2,000 on that. So that's why I try to be more conservative with that stuff. Just because I have a good fear of like audits, I guess. I don't know, not that I get audited a lot, but you don't want to be audited and then get stuck like, okay, we didn't do half of what we said we were going to do. I don't know if that makes sense.
You also, Abigail, don't want to be known as the organization or the artist that has misappropriated grant funds.
You
Or lied to the
100%
grantor
don't want to
about
be
what
known
you
as,
were doing.
as that. Yeah. No, you don't want to. And that's where, like, with people, I'm like, because a lot of times, and I get it, budgets are annoying and people are like, just like $500. That sounds like a good number. And I'm like, no. Think this out for a second, because one, you don't want to underpay yourself. And two, you also don't want to be known as the person who submits applications with like inflated crazy numbers. Because reviewers are smart. They know when they're like, this doesn't cost, $5,000 to market this one day event, right? Like, so that's why always be realistic with everything. And again, sometimes you're still just like somewhat, it's an educated guess, right? You're trying to figure it out to the best of your ability. But again, you want to be as realistic as possible.
And I just want to throw out one more tip so at the beginning, we talked about creating a Word document to put all of the questions in and to fill all your answers into copy and paste. Do the same thing for a budget. Create, whether it's Google Sheets or Excel, create yourself a template, and that template can travel with you from grant to grant. I actually find that to be really helpful. Like, make that template, like put in the project manager, your contractors, like you have all your line items right there. And if you know a little bit about Excel, you can maybe put some math in it too. And that's great for us creatives that maybe don't have the math mind. It will make sure that what you're doing is actually like 1 + 1 is actually equaling 2 on your budget. You don't want to make silly mistakes like that as well. But do use a template, like use Excel the same way. And in a lot of funders, like the one Abigail showed, like they gave a template. Take a couple minutes and just put that into Excel. You'll be glad you did.
Also, this is a bugaboo for me, but I will keep harping on this forever. Make sure that you treat the people you're paying reasonably. Avoid the nonprofit martyr syndrome. It is not helpful. The people who work for you or the people who volunteer for you are professionals and should be treated professionally, and their time should be accounted for as a value of a professional. We actually have a workshop on that called Pay Equity that is up on our website. In addition, I just want to go back to the whole operating costs thing. Some of the funders are getting smarter about this, and 2 organizations are working really hard to make funders smarter about this. One is called Class Action. They're really working on trying to level the playing field amongst nonprofits and for-profit organizations and salaries. The other is called Staffing the Mission, and they're really trying to also work in the same space. But they've been working with funders, grant makers, to try and get them to understand that operating costs are program costs, and that setting a too low level of what you will allow for operating costs in your budgets and in your grants just means a lot of programs don't ever run.
I really appreciate y'all talking about the in-kind greatly, because that definitely, I think it provides, it highlights some really important information for like labor that goes into making events come to life. Yes, be mindful of like making sure the prices are accurate and proper, but it's wonderful to know that what would be just considered volunteer time and you're just going to give your time could have a label in a proposal, so that those who are possibly funding it could see, oh, this entity, this individual artist or whatever, they're going ahead no matter what and making the project happen. And here's proof of that with a column saying in kind, time, or whatever. And it's not, and it could be something simple, like if it's like minimum wage, like here's this person that spent 20 hours of their time, this month doing this thing, and it's a basic, simple, that'd be awesome to be able to include that in the budget and be like, yeah, they're not going to get paid for that, but they are, like the organization funding could see, oh yeah, they are putting their time into this. Yes, being mindful of like not inflating costs. Yes, being mindful of like things like audits, but just it's wonderful to hear and learn more about the fact that exists. And me, like I didn't go to a business school, I didn't go to finance school, I just went to art school, and I'm learning about business as I go. And so these types of workshops are extremely helpful in mentioning little bits of really important details like that could help, a lot of creatives that are trying to be professionally, lucrative outside of becoming an art professor, like they tell art students to do when you go to art school. So I know it's a tangent, but thank you so much for taking the time to spend, give us more details about that topic.
Okay, Brooke, you have something there?
I do. I have kind of a long nebulous question. This has all been super helpful. So thank you guys so much for all of this information. I definitely fall in the camp of people who have a proposal for an idea that's essentially a public project that I had, to me, it has connections with the community, but I had not planned to go. I think I need to enhance the placekeeping function of my project and how that's going to work. And so I've been thinking like, how do I do this in an authentic manner that doesn't fundamentally change my project? Because I already have a really clear idea. I've already worked with the Heritage Park Visitor Center to come up with a plan and proposal that works with their existing site and that contributes and connects with other artwork they already have and their program. But I fear that it does fall into this. It's a thing I'm placing in public, and I don't want it to be one of these, it's getting neglected because it's not involving a big event. And so I'm trying to think about how I can connect it to something that involves people more than just the fact that people walk through the visitor center all the time. So they had offered to hold an unveiling reception. I guess I'm wondering if there's a way I can sort of make that more of a community event, or if this is something that even counts. I guess I'm just wanting a little bit of advice about how to better deal with the placekeeping function of this project.
Can I ask you what the specific part of your art and public art is for the project?
Sure. So I'm so the visitor center Heritage Park Visitor Center has like an educational function of they highlight Fall River's fiber textiles industry history. So they have a number of different exhibits of, mill workers and different things that have been done with fabric in the area. And so, to me, creating fabric sculpture is like, that like obviously connects, but maybe I have to connect the dots more. So I have 3 sculptures that I'm planning that will hang in the center. So they'll be hanging ceiling sculptures. They'll go right underneath the skylight, so light will pass through them, and it will connect the idea of clouds in the harbor with, just highlighting the beauty of fabric and a material that has been used to make clothing in a different way it can be used. And there's a value in public art, going to a place that really your people are basically walking in because they're going to go use the bathroom a lot of the times. This is where people go after they're seeing the fireworks, but look, I'm encountering public art in a place I didn't expect to see it, and there's a value in that. So I mean, that's the heart of what I'm proposing.
Yeah, I mean, this is just my opinion. We see a lot of projects in a similar vein, like connecting the history of textiles or whatnot in New Bedford to like a public art piece. And I think that in itself is a form of placekeeping and placemaking, where you're like connecting the lineage of textiles and into your work. I would just make sure that you're clearly connecting those dots in your proposal, because sometimes we read certain proposals and that, we can connect the dots, but it's very important for it to be like spelled out. Even I think Abby said it, like pretend that you're talking to someone that has no idea, and you're kind of not making it too simple, but it's kind of like a really easy way to understand the project. It sounds exciting. I think a couple of things that come to mind is, I don't know, and again, I don't really know Fall River, or that exact place, but like what kind of event. I think you were kind of like really on point with the opening event or some sort of series of events where you could either like teach possibly like your techniques, or work with someone from the community, that area, that also teaches certain skills with textiles, or just talks about the history of textiles. So I think like linking in some sort of community engagement to ignite what the powerful, I know your work, so I know I can like see that it'll be amazing and like very powerful. So I think any way you can kind of like bring the community in to talk about what you're doing. And then like, I don't know if there's a historic society there, or I don't really know much. Ashley might be able to kind of bring in those partnerships, but I think it sounds great. Those are just my thoughts.
I would add, I don't know if this is possible or if this helps kind of check the placemaking box or placekeeping box, but if there's even a way you could just write up like a couple paragraphs about that could be available for people to take when they come into the visitor center. That's like, here's what this artwork represents. It's not just this, this is the history of Fall River. So it's a handout somebody could leave with to really better understand that the connection to the heritage and history of the area and the relation to your project.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate
Great.
your help.
Okay, Vanya has a question. Vanya Viveros.
No, I didn't have a question. I was just going to try to put in some input for Brooke in regards to Fall River and as far as history goes. I think your project in itself, being textile, is going to be incorporated into Fall River, being known for textile. And so that I think the placekeeping has, you know, a great significance. I think the placemaking, maybe be more specific, like you said, with the unveiling, maybe you can kind of connect with some sort of textile industry that might still be in Fall River, or connect with the Historical Society, which we do have, which has lots of information in regards to the textile community prior to, and engaging with that. There's, you know, there are lots of individuals. I'm not sure what type of textile you're going to be incorporating, Brooke.
They're like, it's going to be sort of organza I mean, it's not a locally made, as far as I know. I don't think any Fall River companies make organza. If they do, I should definitely talk with them, but I don't think that's currently something locally offered.
No, it probably isn't currently offered, but I do believe there was at one point in time. It is quite a beautiful type of textile material. And I do believe there were companies that did. It maybe even Rothschild at one time. So
okay.
yeah, the Historical Society might be able to help you out with that, and maybe connect even with maybe some of the vocational schools to try to get some information, and maybe could connect that with the vocational school, Diamond perhaps, and Jerky's programs with textiles.
Thank you. I appreciate your suggestions.
There's also the New England alpaca fiber pool, and they're in Fall River. And they are also part of the fiber shed, which is, I think it is the South Coast. So that might be something contemporary or current to link back in to make like a full circle.
Thanks.
Great. Well, we're coming up towards the end of our time. Are there any other questions out there? Okay, well, I really want to thank our panel. You guys have done a great job of answering questions and presenting valuable information. And I really want to thank our funders, particularly FRAC and Fall River Arts and Cultural Council and New Bedford Creative, who are the primary sponsors of this evening's workshop. I hope you get to know them as well. I hope that you will continue to follow Practice Best Practice. Feel free to donate if you're in the mood. If you think this was worth a couple of bucks, we have a donate button on our website, and we get 100% of that. That none of that is taken by PayPal, which is a wonderful thing. So I think, unless any of you on the panel want to say any last words.
Just a good
luck,
luck with all
everybody.
your grant writing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
keep going with it.
don't lose faith. I mean, you gotta lose. It's like sports. You're gonna lose some games. You're gonna win some, and you'll feel really great. But don't feel bad if you lose.
Okay, great. Well, keep track of us, and you'll see what all our other workshops are coming up. The next one will be in the spring, and it's going to be marketing for creatives. And then there will be more coming. The next one we know for sure is the one on the taxes for creative, tax planning for creatives and your Schedule C. But we hope to find funding for even more. We try and do at least 6 of these a year if we can get the funding together. So thank you all so much for attending. Again, thanks to our workshop presenters, and thank you all very much. Good night.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
So much.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.